Welcome to Crucial Conversations, a series of conversations with various guests to engage in difficult subjects. This series is coming to you from Central Christian Church in downtown Indianapolis. This month's series is on anti-racism. Our focus is not on interpersonal violence of racism, but systemic racism that is rooted in our institutions, including the church. Please join us each week on Thursdays when we release new episodes. Welcome to Central Christian Church, Crucial Conversation. I am Pastor Louise, and we are excited. We have a wonderful guest today, a good friend of mine, Louise, from Indy10 Black Lives Matter. Jessica and I have known each other for quite some time. We've seen other countries together, specifically Mexico. We went on a trip dealing with immigration, so I'm really glad that she is with us today. So welcome, Jessica, to this space.
Thanks for having me, Courtney.
So about a year ago, in March, Central Christian Church got a grant, and we started working towards anti-racism, but not anti-racism in the sense of interpersonal violence, which whenever we hear the word anti-racism, that's the first thing that comes to our mind. But we started working with a company called Crossroads, who deals with anti-racism training, but also helping churches and organizations become anti-racist institutions. So in that process, we are starting, we've had these conversations, we've had trainings, and we are trying, not just as a staff and a team working at becoming an anti-racist institution, but how do we share that information with our congregation, help them through those same steps that we are going through, and how do we lead people through these particular times? So in that process, we have been trying to connect with voices, people who are a part of institutions who are working at combating anti-racism so that we can be anti-racist society. And so we've had conversation with the general minister and president of the Disciples of Christ, Terry Hort Owens, and now we're going to be having a conversation with you. And so I'm excited that you are with us this morning. And so Jess, tell me, for those who don't know you, because I could spend hours speaking about you, for those who don't know you, tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, where you come from.
Okay, so I am Jessica Louise. Most people know me as an organizer with Indy10 Black Lives Matter. I was born and raised in Indianapolis. Like Louise said, he and I met, I think it was like over a decade ago. We met through a disciples program that was put on, I think, by Church Extension and the Reconciliation Ministry at the time, that was seeking to partner young adults who had an interest in advocacy and community activism, and kind of immerse them in each other's cultures, as well as get to know about some of the inequities that are faced by some of our global community members. So that kind of kicked off my active activism. From there, served the disciples in a variety of ways, even worked for the general ministries for a few years. And then I got connected to Indy10, I would say about 6 or 7 years ago. Wasn't formally a part of it at that time, but supported their work, collaborated with them on a lot of things that they were doing, especially after their group, and I returned from Ferguson, Missouri.
And so I think that's a great segue. So you had been connected with them for some time, but it was the events of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, that got you connected in the Black Lives Matter movement. Is that correct?
Right. So I think before, I was more of like activist. I would support just a variety of things, but didn't really have an understanding of like the theories behind them. So supported immigration reform, supported police reform, also did anti-racism and pro-reconciliation, relationship building within the Disciples of Christ, did, sex health education, comprehensive sex education, just kind of a catch-all. And then the events of there were two things that kind of prompted me to get connected to BLM. One was the shooting death of Trayvon Martin in Florida by George Zimmerman. And I remember that was interesting because I was serving as an adult leader with the General Youth Council for the Disciples of Christ at the time. So I actually had to preach one Sunday. And I remember thinking, like, I don't know what I'm going to talk about. I don't really understand the process of preaching. All I know is that, like, I have 500 kids, as well as these youth leaders who are in my care and other adult leaders' care. And all I can think about is what has happened to this child and the fact that his killer will likely go free. And then shortly after that, with Mike Brown happening, decided to participate in the freedom rides to Ferguson, Missouri. And what was unique about that for me was that not only were we going there to kind of convene with other people nationally and even internationally who were involved in community activism in their own communities, but also receiving training. And I think that that was essential to the work that we do now, learning how to be principled in the work, learning how to crowdfund if you need be, learning how to utilize social media, learning how to network, and learning how to use those things to amplify the message of Black Lives Matter.
So Indy10 BLM has been an active voice throughout Indianapolis, and active in many different ways. But this past summer, we seen them in several different capacities. How do you understand Indy10's role in addressing systematic racism in Indianapolis?
I think that we see ourselves as leaders and also as supporters. So on the one hand, we have a lot of resources as far as, dismantling these systems of oppression that marginalized communities of color face. We also recognize that, as we grow in our work, that there are people who also need to pick up the work and who have a desire to pick up the work. So making sure that we're, offering our social capital and our resources to people. We have a group of young adults that we work with currently, and they kind of emerged organically following the shooting death of Drejon Reed in Indianapolis. So there's about, I want to say 10 to 13 of them that emerged, and they expressed a desire to kind of, move this forward and wanting to know what activism looks like behind the scenes. So we do a little bit of everything. We crowdfund for people who are facing crisis. We keep people safe by establishing safe havens for folks who are in certain areas who are uncertain about their level of safety. We, amplify Black businesses and resources for communities of color. We also have a really intense policy team that, follows closely what is happening in our state, and especially with the city council that we have, and tracks those things and encourages public pressure in order to affect change. So we're involved in a lot of things, and it's exciting and exhausting at the same time.
So when you mention policy team, uh, explain that to me a little bit, because I don't necessarily know what that means. Is that a group of people who are looking at what the city council and what our city is doing as far as policies and laws, and how does that work?
Sure. So yeah, we have so of course our core group, which is, we don't really like to speak in like hierarchical terms, but just for the sake of understanding. So our core group of leadership is involved. And that's the co-founders of Indy10, Kyra and Leah, myself, and then our friend Michelle. And then we also have other people who have a desire to see equity be formed in communities of color, but might not necessarily engage direct action or other things that we do in order to push certain things forward. So we collaborate and we look closely at policies that are being attempted to be passed in Indianapolis and also statewide. One of the things in Indianapolis that we were able to be successful about is one of our Republican city council members attempted to file a proposal or have a proposal be heard that ultimately would criminalize people for serving our population that's experiencing homelessness. So that could be anyone from church groups to, anybody who just decides that maybe they have some extra funds or extra resources and puts together grab bags for people who are living outside or who don't have housing of their own. So that was able to be shut down. Another thing that we worked on statewide was we found that they are trying to criminalize people really who are demonstrating. It's almost as if the lawmakers in our state looked at what happened last summer and that they have now drafted proposals in order to prevent it from happening again. And while I can understand some of the anxiety around the happenings of last summer's uprisings, it also speaks to the necessity of equity in our communities. So we're tracking bills that would strip benefits from people who have been charged with rioting. We're also tracking bills that would empower people who are facing eviction to be legally represented in court. And all of those things, we're trying to make sure that it ties back to our citywide demands. One of our demands for the city that's not necessarily tied to a victim of police brutality is to end cash bail. So one of the things that we were working on was something that was proposed by a state lawmaker that was seeking to make charitable organizations who provided money towards people who were still incarcerated because they could not afford bail. They were trying to nullify that. So that thankfully did not get a hearing, but we had to call on a lot of resources that we had to speak to legal representative groups. We had to reach out to state lawmakers who would be sympathetic to that happening. And we also reached out to a local organization that specifically does that work to help us.
I just listening to you, I can see why you say that it is rewarding and exhausting at the same time. It is a never-ending uphill climb when dealing with this issue. I've seen you several times in front of lawmakers and our council talking about different policies and different things. And this past summer, we started hearing through the movement and in many different circles the phrase defund the police. And that's one of those things in which people love to point and say, you know what, Black Lives Matter. Those individuals who are saying that don't know what they're saying, don't know what they're talking. We're going to be unsafe because of that. And I feel that many people don't truly understand what that means. And so I recall you, I think you were talking about police funding, and you went there, you had your shirt on that said defund the police. So Jessica, what does it mean to defund the police?
Sure. So for other people, it means simply reducing the police budget to reallocate it for critical community resources. For us, ultimately, we see it as a vehicle to abolition. As students, practitioners, and facilitators of abolition, it is our duty to carry that forward. And we know that the prison industrial complex only perpetuates harm. It does not seek to, establish justice or equity in communities, because if it did, it would not be privatized and commodified. We wouldn't see people who are incarcerated facing just disproportionate injustice inside of that system simply as a means of punishment. So for us, we are behind gradually reducing the police and its supports budgets until it reaches zero, but also reallocating those funds into community sourced and community based entities. One of the things that we are working on is a mental health task force that's going to be made up of mental health practitioners who can respond to crisis calls where the police are not trained or equipped to do so. That was brought about following the death of Eleanor Northington, who was a middle aged Black woman who was in crisis and sought help at a church. And when the police responded to it, and when everything was said and done, she was left dead. So we know that there are people who are better equipped to deal with those things because they are studied, they are taught, they are licensed, and there are people who have a vested interest and live in the communities that they're serving. So ultimately, when we say defund the police, and especially defund IMPD, we want to see those dollars taken from this entity who historically and presently has a duty of perpetuating harm in our communities, and seeing that used to help heal some of those voids.
Yeah, and so some of the argument about that is, Indianapolis has had a high crime rate and had high murder rate for several years, and the thought is, hey, more police will make our streets safer. The increase of police has happened, but violence and these things continue. So, if the answer isn't more police, then what is the particular answer? And in our lower income communities, we noticed that there are a lot of different ways in which we can address some of those issues. It sounds, and I can't recall, I was having a conversation with somebody the other day, and I'm not sure what state was doing this, but it was talking about how they took away 20% of the police's budget. And in taking away 20% of the police's budget, it was for dealing with 2% of a specific issue, which was like the example you gave. And because of that, 2% to help out 20%. Numbers mix me, but regardless, what they noticed was they were able to address some of the mental health issues in the area because they were having people who were trained to those particular things. Like yourself, I feel like our police are not trained to handle certain situations. So why are we putting that responsibility on them, right? Which leads us to a bigger question, right? So if we're going to address some of these systematic issues that are affecting the communities here in Indianapolis, what can churches like Central Christian Church and others do to support the work that Indy Black Lives Matter 10 is working at?
Sure. So I always tell people that we need resources. And so if that is skill, if that is finances, if that is supporting or amplifying any of the work that we do, then it's critical to the work that we do. One of the things that we were successful with is partnering with a couple of our members partnered with Indy Pride and successfully navigated them through divesting from using the police for their events, which is huge because Indy Pride each summer is a multi-million-dollar event. So having them collaborate with Black with Black femme organizers, and for them to say, we hear what you're saying, we understand the historical reference of Pride, and because of it, it is our duty not to utilize this source that is historically and presently harmful, is huge. We would love for churches to become more involved with speaking with their congregants and having candid conversations and also measurables on how to reduce police presence in their neighborhoods. If that means setting up a community watch with community members, then that could be something. One of our sister chapters chapters in, I believe it's either DC or Paterson, New Jersey, has set up what's called a cop watch. So training people on, if you do encounter the police, here's what you should do so that you can, engage that situation safely, but also so that there can be a record of conduct. Churches can host websites. They can pay fees for us to receive trainings, and offer to sponsor us. One of the things that we relied on churches this past summer that was a great help to us was helping us to establish safe space during the demonstrations. So some people just wanted to go out, have their voice be heard, and go home, which they are completely entitled to. So the churches played a critical role in being an obvious and visible safe space for people who needed a break from demonstrations to be able to gather, either to receive respite or to receive medical care or even spiritual care if needed, because it's spiritually exhausting having to demonstrate and put your body on the line each day. We would also encourage churches to dig deeper into their theology and to find ways that their theology can meet social justice. I think that's one of the things that I wrestled with the disciples, that even though we establish a table where all are welcome, who are we holding space for? It's like, are we holding space for people to continue to harm others simply so that we can say that we are welcoming to all and that all are welcome at God's table? Or are we recognizing that by holding the door open for harm to be perpetuated and sustained, that we are marking ourselves as unsafe spaces? Definitely reading resources and making sure that theological text is being mirrored in praxis, and that it's not just being, I'm going to seminary, I'm preaching, I'm not really engaging my community outside of that. Asada Shakur said famously that she didn't want to just stay in the books because that's not where things are happening. You have to be out in the street and you have to be out in your community to understand the true impact of the police and their state backing on our communities.
You bring up an interesting point there. You and I are both brought up in the church, right? And I've always noticed that individuals who are brought up in the church and may have had experiences lead them to work towards the same thing in different ways. I don't want to make an assumption. However, why do you think that the generation of individuals who are participating in movements like Black Lives Matter have stopped doing it through the church and rather through other organizations? Has something happened along the way in which the church has, in your opinion, what has happened where's the disconnect, you think, that people have decided, you know what, this is no longer the vehicle I'm going to use in order to combat this. I'm going to move in this direction?
Sure. So I think that's two-pronged. One is that, there is spiritual support, but that spiritual support is more like a silent partner, which is favorable. So we don't have to worry about the politics of, saying, hey, I spoke with Central Christian Church today, and Louise said that they're ready to nuck if you buck if they need to, because all of your congregants might not be there. So we appreciate the silent partnership. But in addition to that, I think the generational divide is an imbalance in who has access to resources. So if we look at historically what our caregivers, their age and what they had to tolerate and what that meant as far as them being able to survive and how that brought them to the point that they are now. And then for us, a lot of us were coming out of college, around 2008 when everything started to crash and burn. So we're already used to uncertainties with our finances. We have crippling student loan debt. We don't have access to health insurance in the ways that our caregivers or their caregivers had. And then on top of that, we, have a vested political interest in what's happening because we see in real time how it's affecting us. So it's something. I can't even, it's something.
And so do you think that the church and Black Lives Matter can coexist in working towards working towards being an anti-racist society?
I think that there is coexistence possible. I think that people have different ministries and different ways of acting out what they see their charge to activism being. For me, I'm not as dedicated to anti racism work as I once was because I look at that as allies work. In my Black queer body, I don't consider it to be my duty to take emotional labor and to devote that to white people or other people of historical and present privilege to help them dismantle and combat their internalized privilege. I would rather use that energy towards amplifying and uplifting my community and empowering the people that I'm in community with. Now, that doesn't mean that this work isn't valid or that it's not needed. It's just that I don't have to carry that burden in my Black body. There are people who are willing, able, ready, practiced, and principled enough to carry that forward. And when needed, they can call on Black radicals and Black revolutionaries to come and be accountability partners, to come and validate or underscore some of the work that they're doing. But I think in order for us to coexist, that we need to be clear about who has what role, and that when those roles are established and when they're committed to, that's when we're going to see change. I wouldn't expect somebody from Black Lives Matter to come to y'all's church and preach, especially if that is not their religious background, you know? But also, there's room for the church to kind of overlap into some of the work that we're doing. So I think coexist is probably a good way to put it, that everyone has their role and that we can assist each other so that the load and the burden isn't too heavy to bear.
You know, you bring up just a wonderful point that I think the conversations that I've been having hasn't been brought up, right? When you talk about people of color and you talk about institutions that may be predominantly white, the thought is if you were to work towards being anti-racism, the emotional toll and energy it takes would not allow you to uplift and do the things that you want to do. So as I hear you say, you have to separate it, right? Which for me, as I listen, must be hard and difficult, right? Especially if you have friends and communities that are working towards those, right? So it's almost like in a sense of violent separation. I have to just, you just have to push to the side. But at the same time, I think what I hear in you is we can exist parallel to each other, right? As you are working, I am working. And there may be a point where our roads are going to converge, and it should converge, right? If we're going towards the same direction. So direction is uplifting people of color, Black communities. What I'm doing and others are doing is working towards breaking down racism, anti-racism society, and these things need to meet, right? And when we meet, we're going to be at a mutual ground of understanding. We cannot meet at that mutual ground because you haven't got there yet. So it almost feels like at times, you know, yourself and others in the movement are going much further ahead and just waiting for others to get there, right? Because that's the only way, right?
Yeah.
You know, for not only for physical for survival, but what I hear from you a lot in many different ways, I hear a lot of just also emotional, right? Emotional and spiritual survival, right? Like we cannot separate those two, right? We have only been dealing with the physical burden of being Black and brown in our communities, and it's important that that's one aspect. But what I hear from you is yes, but here are some other areas that are just as important to our life and our moving forward. So, wow, I really appreciate that. I mean, that really has made me think about some questions I'm going to ask some of our other guests, right? That whole parallel of walking together. I really appreciate that, Jessica. I mean, that's just amazing.
Yeah. And it's necessary. I mean, you think about, I think, you know, when I was coming up in the disciples and they talked a lot about spiritual gifts, and it's not on you to try to measure yourself by someone else's spiritual gift. So if I've been given a radical imagination and the determination to actualize those things and someone is not yet there, I can use my gift to, make it public and make it known and make it accessible what these things are and why it's necessary. But then it's on the other person to pick it up and to internalize it and to do something with it. So there's a role either way, it's necessary.
So how has the Black church been supportive of you and what you have been doing? Do you feel like you've had that support from the Black church? You're smiling right now.
Because you're trying to get me in trouble. I'll say this.
No, it's like you say, it's accountability, right? It's accountability, right?
It is accountability.
Right.
It is accountability. So on the one hand, I'll start with this. There are Black spiritual practitioners who have been consistent in supporting this work and me personally since Dre'Jon Reed was shot and killed in May of 2020. I feel conflicted about calling on Black churches to do more because I think that opens us up into who has access to what and why, and what type of support and resources Black churches have, and what that means as far as where our church as a denomination, as a state, and as a city, where it stands and who is able to get what. Black churches, unfortunately, don't have the luxury of being as radical as they'd like, because for us, well, for them, it may be a means of survival. If you're in survival mode, you're not able to lend social equity or social capital to something that could alienate you from resources that you need in order to go day to day. On the other hand, if we look at, there just has to be some meeting of theory and praxis. So what does it mean if we get on social media, if we get into the pulpit and we preach radical theory, we preach radical theology, we preach feminist and womanist theology, and we have female, representation and femme representation in the general ministries, but that doesn't translate locally, right? So it can be disappointing. There were, like I said, I worked for the Disciples for several years in one of the general ministries. I was the only Black in-house employee at one of the general ministries at the Disciples Center for several years. So I'm very well versed in Black leadership in the Disciples. I think especially when you see someone who was formerly aligned with the Disciples and who has even served in leadership within the Disciples, and there's no expression of support, that it can be disappointing. But also, that's not something that I really internalize. I also understand that I have more of a radical stance than a lot of people are comfortable with. So to align with me and my radical stance could be the difference between some folks having a job or not, and I've had to learn to not center myself in this movement, which is tough, because I'm good for being like, that's wrong. What are you doing? I've had to kind of prioritize, okay, not getting it here, but am getting it here, so let me focus my energy here.
Yeah, and it goes back to what you said. When you're a part of that institution, where do you want to spend your energy in, right? And if you're constantly the person raising your hand and pointing towards, hey, that needs to change, it can become awfully tiring. But I think you do make a good point about the church as a whole, and I just think about, especially in minority communities, and we see this within the Hispanic church as well, we have so many of our leaders who are predominantly male, right? And so when you have males driving these contexts and pushing these things and making these connections, we often forget about the predominant powerful voices within the church, which have in my community have always been women, right? You may have had a male pastor, but the church is run by the women in the church, right? So why isn't it in when we make these connections, we have to have those those feminine voices out in the front, because they have been leading for so long. So yeah, again, I didn't ask that to get you in trouble, but that also will get us down.
I'm used to it.
that will get us down a way different topic for another time, because I think there's so much that you and I can continue to be working on in the parallel, right? So how do I get this side, to where you're going? And you know what, you have presented me a very good internalized question for my own future, right? Is how long do I still want to stay within a predominantly white institution and spend my energy in helping dismantle and break down these things when I can be uplifting people within my own community? So I appreciate the conversation today. You have, you always come, you always provide, Jess. You bring it every time. I really appreciate it. So,
I try to.
once again, thank you so much, Jessica Louise. We want to thank her for her time today. We want to thank her for her spirit and leadership within Indy10 Black Lives Matter. And I hope to bring you into other conversations in the future. Thank you so much, Jess.
Of course, Fran. Thanks for having me. To freedom.
All right. God bless.